Thank you. Early Christians saw the multitude of creatures as discrete, individual, fragmentary echoes of divine wisdom. Combined, they formed an ordered manifestation of God, a theophany established at the beginning. This grammar, written by God, however, has seemed elusive over the past 2 centuries. Two major challenges loom in the popular awareness. First, biological evolution, in which one species may slowly be transformed into another, genetically incompatible species, indicates that creation's relationship to wisdom cannot be stable at the species level. There is no intrinsically finite number of kinds in the world, no constancy in the way that the species express the wisdom of God. Responding to this challenge and somewhat aligning with a postmodern suspicion of classification, some theologians see our naming of animals and nature as ambiguous, an act of power that cuts the world at the joints less of reality than of our own bid for dominance. Second, advances in artificial intelligence seem to reinforce this view. AI works best when it does not deal with the world as a collection of discrete human-named objects that can be defined and detected by logical procedures representing propositional definitions. The brittle, symbolic AI developed in the 1950s through the 1980s worked with predefined sets of discrete categories standing in definite relations with one another, making it difficult to apply beyond constrained situations. They falter wherever discrete categories are difficult to detect, unknown, or too subtly intertwined, such as when distinguishing and identifying objects captured on camera or human words recorded through a microphone. Tasks that were once expected to be easy in comparison to supposedly higher level activities, such as playing chess. Especially hard for AI are those tasks in which humans attain to refined and effective sensibilities that, nonetheless, are difficult to articulate conceptually, such as aesthetics, improvisation, humor, and the game of Go. We excel at naming things and imposing our will on the world, but when we try to define objectively what we have named, it slips away. The problems cited above, along with immense advances in computing power, have brought recent eminence to so-called non-symbolic or statistical AI, a set of methods among which artificial neural networks hold greatest fame. Such computer programs do not hunt for propositionally defined objects in the data, but adapt themselves statistically to a shifting pattern of input. An artificial neural network is a computer program that mathematically simulates an interconnected set of simplified brain neurons. It receives a pattern of information as numerical values at its input nodes, which are then connected with various strengths to layer upon layer of further nodes. The input pattern is transformed as its elements are recombined and processed until something else comes out on the final layer of the network. A network can be trained to produce desired responses, say, to predict travel patterns or to recognize faces, by tuning the contribution made by each node to each recombination, and in due course to the final result. By this training, the network begins to resonate with the entangled relations within the input data, transforming them to make explicit what is of interest to the trainer. Neural networks and other statistical methods underlie self-driving cars, programs that beat world champions in Go and chess, the voice recognition of Siri and Alexa, Google Translate, webmail autocomplete functions, the curated recommendations delivered by Netflix and Amazon, and recent amazing feats of generated poetry, paintings, and prose by DALL-E and ChatGPT. So, what are these networks doing? Theologian David Bentley Hart calls the, quote, operations of a computer merely physical events devoid of meaning, end quote. Computers, he argues, are not minds, not even models. Like printed books, they are systems of signs that exist as signs only at the whim of the beholder. Having meanings, he writes, only so long as they are objects of the representing mind's attention. We compute, he claims, not the computer. We seem then to have a double doubt regarding creation's grammar. First, discrete categories fail because world categories or essences are only convenient impositions. Second, the computer programs that seem best to lay hold of whatever depth does underlie our judgments are themselves contingent mappings without any intrinsic significance of their own. So then, is creation's grammar a mere imposition of human purposes and categories upon a welter without significance? Is all naming or classification only an act of power? Our brains cutting reality for survival, and our technical artifacts cutting it for profit? In reply, I offer 2 points. First, 5th century theologian Augustine of Hippo gives an account of the created order that makes sense of the failures and successes of AI methods by explaining the world as God's self-expression, but as a kaleidoscopic refraction of his wisdom, rather than as a collection of discrete objects standing in crisp relations. Second, and more briefly, these ontological considerations can be united to Augustine's account of interpretive judgment as a moral act bound up with love, in order to reveal the deep neural network as a kind of memory that maps the world to human purposes. As such a memory, the network may draw us to reduce reality to the measurable scope of this worldly ambitions, or, as a pointer to reality, it may perhaps serve one's regathering of the created echoes of divine wisdom. I propose that many problems bedeviling symbolic methods are solved handily by a neural network because, in a manner of speaking, the network is receptive to, imprinted by, the structure of the world as presented to it. We might say that it develops a point of view, not a conscious experience, but something like the classical notion of the mind's conformity to the thing. Although here, that conformity is always constrained by the task for which the AI is trained. Augustine describes a world amenable to this solution. Creation's deep coherence, he argues, rests on the rationes, reasons or principles of the world that are irreducible to verbal definitions, but that can be engaged conceptually by our judgments. God is the source of the rationes. His single and simple life is truth and wisdom, and he has created all things in light of what Augustine calls the eternal reasons, the aeternas rationes, aspects of divine wisdom that are undifferentiated in himself, but distinguished as simply multiple and uniformly multiform, Augustine writes, through the prisms of God's created expressions here below. Like the spectrum of colors, continuous in itself, but differentiated by our labeling, God's simple wisdom is contingently divided in being expressed through the panoply of creatures. There is no necessarily fixed number of species, but infinite potential varieties. Divine wisdom is expressed doubly, then, in the kinds of things created according to the rationes, and in God's providential governance of the whole, whereby the ways of these things are expressed in their interaction with one another. As for kinds, the nature and capacities displayed in the life of each created thing reflect, facet-like, the goodness and wisdom of God. Augustine writes, and I quote, "Through wisdom all things were made, and the changes that we now see in creatures, measured by the lapse of time as each one fulfills its proper function, comes to creatures from causal reasons, the rationes, implanted in them, which God scattered as seeds at the moment of creation. When he spoke and they were made, he commanded and they were created." End quotation. Thus, in the contingency of history itself, God's providential governance elicits creatures' interacting harmonies by the unfolding of temporal events. How might we apply these rationes to the world as seen by a neural network? Consider a hypothetical but technologically realistic example trained to distinguish grasses, wildflowers, and trees with fidelity to distinct scientific categories. In earlier layers of the network, we might observe activity quite out of keeping with these hierarchical classifications, as, for instance, if certain areas of the network were to be equally highly activated by the subtle ridging on a blade of grass, the stalk of a valerian wildflower, and the needles of certain conifers. Were this but a matter of surface-level similarity, with no more conceptual heft than the redness of a coral snake being grouped with that of a red panda, then we might agree that the network's activity reveals less about nature's integrity than about features that conveniently accord with our purposes. But the visual similarities of grass, stalk, and needle are not mere surface coincidence. A ridged configuration strengthens these plants' narrow structures, which are mostly hollow, but must remain stiff to perform their function. In grouping these three ridges, then, the neural network is attuned to what we know to be a manifested harmonization of gravity, force, of wind, capillary action, and, in the movement of fluid, a hint of metabolism. These three plants are not at all closely related genetically, nor all common to the same environment, yet, as expressions of this kingdom of life, they have settled into a groove that expresses something not only about these particular organisms, nor even only about their local environment, but also about the natural harmony of the earth as a whole, something of wisdom's rationes, indeed. The neural network, at its best, is attuned not to happy accidents, but to the rationes. The network's mathematics do not refute so much as deepen our notion of concepts, as not replicas but engagements with these rationes. The network's output categories are determined by human designers. Therefore, the network must accomplish a mapping from the rationes to the interests of the network's trainer. It will work insofar as our classifications can preserve the rationes, much as our own categories must in experience, even if not in explicit definition. What does it mean to preserve the rationes, or for the network or our concepts to engage those rationes, even as this engagement entails a foisting of our will upon reality? David Bentley Hart is right that the network's outputs are human-designed purposes. That is how semantics are attributed to the AI program. Yet, for Augustine, this does not reduce concepts or computers to arbitrary exercises of power. First, for Augustine, concepts in the human mind are begotten, are generated by intentional and moral judgments that, in turn, form the very fabric of our understanding as an engagement with the rationes, much like the neural network. Second, insofar as the network maps to particular purposes of ours, it supports what Augustine would call knowledge, scientia, an understanding subserving the good use of the world, always developed for a particular task AI points beyond itself, but in pointing toward us before it points to the world, it cannot transcend a utilitarian frame. Third, I conclude that since AI cannot escape the morally infused nature of all human thought, we must develop a spirituality of AI, wherein we do not permit it to stand between us and the world, lest we remain self-imprisoned in the knowledge only of our own designs. First, meaning as moral. Every understanding involves an act of will. For Augustine, our acts interpreting natural things, conventional signs, and artifacts all follow the same fundamental sequence. We apprehend something through the senses, we judge it as good, that is, as real, with respect to something else, and then we cling to it. We cling to that goodness with our approbation or love. We conceive a mental word, a verbum mentis, that is, a conceptual understanding. The verbum mentis is not a spoken word, nor an autonomous form, but a particular embrace by the mind of some facet of reality according to its ratio. An embrace, however, that is shaped by the knower's own assessment and love of its goodness. For Augustine, in the words of Luigi Gioia, intellectual knowledge is not the result of an infusion in our mind of a pre-existing reality. It is the production of a new reality. This verbum mentis is truer as it approaches an embrace of the ratio as that ratio is. And this means that one's own desire and love must conform to reality, rather than plucking out from reality only that which is congenial to the stance that one has brought with oneself. Even our recognitions of a narwhal or a no parking sign are not neutral, because our judgments of meaning issue within the general frame of our cultural, societal, and personal values and position within the world. Every act of understanding entails a moral judgment, and habitual moral judgments of this sort form our habit of seeing the world. Augustine calls the ground of this habitual vision our memory, memoria. While corporeal things cannot be kept uninterruptedly before the physical eyes, memoria makes present the object of the mind striving, according to our love for it, such that God and corporeal objects alike can be present uninterruptedly. The memoria is not, however, a movie screen or a data repository. Rather, it is an implicit knowledge of objects and experiences, a fabric of varyingly accurate rationes built up from apprehensions in verba mentis. Contained implicitly in this fabric, objects can be said to be present to the mind even without conscious cognition. Desire or love, the will's implicit judgment concerning the thing known, draws that object anew into explicit thought as a verbum mentis in the intellect. As Augustine writes in his Confessions, I hid in my memory not the images, but the realities. That is, the rationes as construed in the verba mentis begotten by love. So more than permitting implicit presence, the memoria is a kind of ground for thought. It is formed by thought. One's past apprehensions become the fibers from which one's present intuitive leaps are made, and concepts past and present are rewoven. As built up from the verba mentis, shaped by the will, the memoria constitutes the deep substructure of understanding, wherein the verba of past and present, past and future subsist. Like the palate, the memoria is cultivated by the things one tastes attentively, and it potentiates what and how one is able to taste. Past judgments shape the memoria, and the memoria is also the substrate wherein the resulting verba are sustained. It is our sensitivity to reality, the primary colors of our thought, our way of seeing the world, a habit of mind shaping the judgments that will come readily to us, and a sort of sedimentary aggregate of the verba begotten over one's lifetime. A particular ratio is a knot in the tapestry of reality. The memoria is a corresponding tapestry of mind from which the verbum mentis comes forth. Finally, inasmuch as the will and the affections are susceptible of reformation, the memoria is malleable as well. So second, Augustine's view of knowledge. As an artifact, the programmed computer receives its semantics, its meaning, from the meaning-making intentional frame constituted by the judgments of those who share that frame. Now, the trained neural network maps the rationes of some data set to categories that are of interest to the system designer's moral and conceptual engagement with reality. So the neural network is an artifactual memoria. As with a network sensitive to ridged stalks, this memoria is not transparently interpretable in terms of scientific classifications or formal conceptual relationships, but nonetheless, it encodes the rationes of its input data as these are shaped by the wills of its designers and users, mapping reality to human interest and usefulness. Thus, its meaning as used in the world involves both the verba mentis that shape the system's architecture through its trained outputs and the moral stances implicit in the goals and purposes to which its users put the AI. When it is read as a standard, taken as a prompt for action, or contemplated for what it reveals, the AI thus has ultimate reference not to God, as with the rationes of the natural world, but to ourselves. It is fitting to conclude this paper by recalling Peter Norvig's suggestion that we might rightly be satisfied with statistical AI, which, he says, describes what happens, but doesn't answer the question of why. I suggest that such satisfaction would be dangerous because the opacity of the network's reasoning lends itself to becoming a replacement for, rather than an invitation to, the world, reducing our engagement with the world to the scope of our desires and intentions, to the point that we risk rewriting the world itself as a resource for the accomplishment of our designs, with ourselves rather than divine wisdom as its ultimate ratio, ourselves as its ultimate meaning. I cannot fully expound these familiar themes here, but I gesture to a landscape that demands re-exploration in light of AI. We deal with the network in terms of outputs, for which our own goals are the necessary framing. The network's interior, even as an echo of memoria, is recondite, is hidden. It is manifested first to us by the network's responses to various inputs, somewhat as an animal's instincts are manifested in its behavior. Like these instincts, which must be studied and tested, and even then not always fully understood, the network, seen from without, suggests its implicit concepts, but it hides them from our view. An animal does not judge the world. It does not theorize about, but works within the reality with which it interacts. Similarly, the neural network, for all its sophisticated ability to predict data correlations that we might never have imagined, remains in this sense at the level of the animal. We, on the other hand, ask about reality because it is by judgment that we come to understand. We can see the animal as an invitation to judgment. Acting according to its own ratio, the animal is itself a mapping of the world that we might judge. But the neural network invites our judgment especially because it ultimately concerns us, who have determined the outputs of interest. The network is not a theory or explanation of the world, but it is itself something to be theorized and conceptualized. At best, it may help us to interrogate our own purposes, or it may redirect us, as with the ridged stalks of the plants, to the meaning of the world. At its worst, however, the network may hide the world from us by hiding its own workings, except for its efficacious aid to our own goals. The interior behavior of artificial neural networks suggests a rich ontology well accounted for by Augustine's rationes. On the other hand, if the opaque network becomes a buffer between us and the world, then we risk a very different assumed ontology. The ancient Babylonians, unwondering masters of data fitting, sought exacting astrological forecasts, but showed no interest in astronomical mechanisms. Their cultural orientation matched their cosmogony, in which the world was fashioned from the bisected carcass of a primordial chaos dragon slain by her own descendants and held together by ever vigilant heavenly guardians. It is not a world that invites science, because it is not a world that requites wonder. Redolent of menace, it is not to be understood, but only to be controlled. Our stance of will toward the world shapes our own implicit practical ontology, our reading of the world's rationes, and a particular actualization of its capacity for meaning. If statistical AI is used as an unexamined instrument of reduction, harnessing the world without understanding, then we shall become practical Babylonians, the instrumental framing of the network dominating our framing of the world itself. We won't be able to see beyond the tools that we use to control the world. As John Cavadini puts it, for Augustine, quote, "The sign systems that we create are no better than the love in which they were ultimately begotten," end quote. What then must we do? We must inquire of the world, and we must let the network lead us back to it by inquiring into the network, by striving to understand its working, and refusing the easy claim that it bears no relation to the generative processes of nature itself. In that, it must reckon, in some sense, with the rationes that have divine wisdom as their source. A network that cannot accommodate the fullness of the world can still perhaps lead us to it by routes unexpected. This leads us to the use of artificial intelligence as a spiritual activity. Our behavior and our goals are the inescapable framing of the network itself, and so our deployment of these artifacts must imitate God's providential governance of the universe, arranging and further elucidating the rationes to yield meanings that they cannot possess simply on their own. As we undertake this godlike activity of interacting with the world, will we seek greater understanding or only greater efficacy? Let us not be the harsh imperators of an unstable world like the Babylonians. Instead, let us seek an unveiling of the dynamics of creation for use according to their intrinsic goodness and meaning as theophany. The network maps natural things to conventional meanings, but if we return to the world, we prevent those meanings from merely signifying ourselves. The right use of AI does not depend merely on the architecture of our systems, nor even on the ethics that we attempt to embed in them, but on the ultimate stance of will that we adopt unto a false knowledge or a true scientia, and finally, wisdom. This is the challenge of AI, our moral framing of which will determine what of reality we permit ourselves to see. Thank you.